Then we get started. Hopefully that's enough time for folks to update their Zoom and they can join us as that becomes available. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Scholar Strategy Network New Jersey, Philadelphia chapters event on balancing being a public intellectual and traditional academic careers. My name is Julia Sass-Rubin, and I'm a professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. I'm also the co-lead of the New Jersey, Philadelphia chapter of the Scholar Strategy Network. I would like to start by introducing my fellow co-lead, Temple Law Professor Susan DeJarnette. There she is. And our two chapter fellows, both of whom are PhD students at the Blaustein School, Stephanie Walsh, you want to wave, and Lauren Nolan. Hey. So the Scholar Strategy Network is a national nonprofit organization with 36 chapters dedicated to building a nationwide culture where research regularly informs policy at every level. And SSN does this through connecting scholars to civic leaders and organizing scholars to testify before congressional committees to make research matter to policy, by helping scholars develop media strategies that make a difference in today's policy debates, and strengthening the role of research in public discourse. SSN's chapters in the states build communities where research systematically informs policy by connecting local researchers with key policy players. And SSN provides a number of really helpful trainings for scholars to help them learn to map the policy landscape and build relationships with leaders who work on the issues that they study, empowering scholars to become players in the policy debate. So you can learn more about the Scholar Strategy Network by accessing the website, which also has information on how to become a member. It's free. There's no secret handshake as far as I know. And it's a really wonderful organization. There's a number of folks from SSN National on this call, Danielle and Pamela and Dominic. So it's great to have them here. Public-facing scholarship is obviously a key part of Scholar Strategy Network's mission. And last spring, our chapter hosted a panel of scholars who do community-engaged research. Today's event is focused on the other aspect of public-facing scholarship, being a public intellectual. These are terms that have different meanings for different people. And the definition that we're using is, I'm going to just make you all feel like you're in class by putting up this PowerPoint, but just real briefly. So this is a definition that was put forward by MIT professor Alan Lightman. And it's this idea that a public intellectual can be someone who speaks and writes for the public exclusively about their own discipline. It can be someone who speaks and writes about their discipline and how it relates to the social, cultural, and political world around it. Or it can be someone who becomes almost a symbol. And the example he uses is Einstein. So a person that stands for something far larger than the discipline from which he or she originated. That's it for PowerPoint, I promise. We're very excited to hear from 3 scholars today who are joining us and who are all clearly public intellectuals. And after I introduce them, which I will do in alphabetical order, I will moderate the first part of the panel, which will consist of just questions and discussion with the panelists. We then will open it up for audience questions for the panelists. And so if you have a question, please put it in the chat to Stephanie Walsh, who is going to be moderating the second half or that portion of today's event. And with that, let me introduce the panelists. So I'm very excited to have Daniel Laurison, Lynnette Mawhinney. I should have asked how to pronounce it. Lynnette, how do you pronounce your name?
Mawhinney.
Mawhinney, thank you very much. And Gregory Squires. So Daniel is an associate professor of sociology at Swarthmore College. He's a 2021 to 2023 Carnegie Fellow and the acting editor of the British Journal of Sociology. His research is on issues of class and social mobility and class and racial inequality in US politics. He is the author of Producing Politics Inside the Exclusive Campaign World, Where the Privileged Few Shape Politics for All of Us, and The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged. Lynnette is a professor and chair of the Department of Urban Education at Rutgers University, Newark. She's also affiliated faculty in the Department of Africana Studies. She was a former high school English teacher, always a really great start. at the School District of Philadelphia. And she has, for more than the last decade, she's conducted teacher trainings in the US, as well as in Vietnam, Taiwan, Thailand, South Africa, and Egypt. Her research focuses on the professional lives of urban teachers and pre-service teachers, with a special focus on teachers of color. She's the author or editor of 5 books. And in 2020, she was the recipient of the American Educational Studies Association's Critics' Choice Book Award for her book, There Has to Be a Better Way: Lessons from Former Urban Teachers. And she also has written children's books, including Lulu, the One and Only, which received an acclaimed starred Kirkus Review, and the Notable Social Studies Trade Book Award by the National Council for Social Studies and the Children's Book Council. And our third panelist is Greg Squires, who is a research professor and professor emeritus in the sociology department of George Washington University. He has published 17 books, 76 peer-reviewed journal articles, 32 book chapters, and over 100 newspaper op-eds and magazine articles. He's also received multiple career achievement awards, and his work has appeared in both academic and general interest publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, the American Prospect, and American Banker. He currently is researching the impact of inclusionary zoning and related housing policies on community health, racial bias in home appraisals, and the adverse consequences of environmental degradation. So with that, let me start with our questions. So let me start by asking the panelists to weigh on, to describe the work that they have done or are doing now that would fall under that definition of being a public intellectual, and how each of you came to do that work. And whichever one of you wants to go first. Any volunteers?
I'll go first,
Right.
verse alphabetical order, I guess. Well, I've done a lot of work with community organizations and government agencies on fair housing related issues. So for example, when I was at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, I got together with a couple of veteran community organizers, and we created an organization called the Fair Lending Coalition. I analyzed bank lending practices with my students, and the organization would use those analyses to identify problematic lenders in Milwaukee and negotiate community reinvestment agreements with them. We generated several $1 million of loans to traditionally underserved communities in Milwaukee. In the 1990s, I spent a couple of years at HUD. They invited me to come there to draft a regulation clarifying the application of the Fair Housing Act to homeowners insurance policies. The regulatory initiative was a complete failure because of politics. We never even got the reg out of the Assistant Secretary's office. But during that time, I was working with a number of groups who were plaintiffs in administrative complaints and lawsuits against major property insurers, and we were able to generate a number of settlements that resulted in insurance and employment opportunities and investment opportunities, again, in traditionally underserved neighborhoods. Today, I'm working with Sherelle Parker, the majority leader of the Philadelphia City Council, on appraisal bias issues. She created a working group of appraisers and academics and advocates and others in Philadelphia. We released a report a couple months ago. We've written 3 op-eds, and right now we're working on a package of legislative initiatives for the Philadelphia City Council. So those are just 3 examples of the kinds of work that I've done under that definition, I think, of public intellectual work.
Great, thanks, Greg. Lynnette, Daniel?
Reverse alphabetical order, I'm next. Hello, everybody. Thanks for spending this late afternoon, early evening with us. So in terms of my current work and what I'm doing now, a lot of my stuff is around teachers of color, diversifying the field, being able to retain teachers of color, thinking about, administrators and policymakers and all this work and what it means. So just finished a study that we were looking at. I was consulting with Research for Action, and we were looking at why is there a mass exodus of Black teachers within the School District of Philadelphia. That work has actually been presented, and so we kind of go back to the district, but also think about policymakers and what does that mean. I just got a Spencer grant, and I'm working on doing a photo voice project with teachers of color. So a lot of the work that I think about being, a public scholar intellectual is really just bringing it, for me, it's bringing it back to the teachers, supporting them. So this is a photo voice project, but it's the idea of building these affinity groups for teachers of color. So they'll have the support through the year. We're working with art and photography. At the end, we plan to have an actual photo exhibit where the teachers will display their work. And that will be, we will be inviting policymakers and administrators at that time, because we're really talking about what does it mean to be a teacher of color today. And we're also planning to build a website with this work, and with the idea of the website can be a portal for other teachers of color to kind of come together. So in terms of recruiting, but also retaining teachers of color. And then I have this trajectory of children's work, which I found has been really great in terms of thinking about how to make my work speak to children directly, or for teachers to be able to use directly in the classroom. So I have a children's picture book that has been very well received, but currently I'm working on a graphic novel, which is about the biography of Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark and all of her influence in her research as a psychologist and what it meant for Brown versus Board. But a lot of people don't know that her work still continues. She 70 plus years ago built a center in Harlem, which is still standing today and thriving, and it actually has a school connected to it, but working with kids with special needs, and specifically Black and Brown kids. So going from the 40s onward. So really just highlighting her voice, but doing it's for middle grades. So for middle schoolers, and doing this other way of thinking about art differently to connect with them, and that's why it's going to be a graphic novel.
Wow. Okay, great. Daniel, I feel very lazy.
Yeah, so I think my sort of public-facing work has been a bit more diffuse. It's interesting. I think all of us have also sort of community-engaged scholarship that we draw from in the more public-facing work that we do. I think they go very nicely together. So I guess there's sort of three pieces of things that I do or have done that might be called public scholarship or public intellectual. My first book, The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged, was about the class origin pay gap in top occupations in the UK. So people from poor and working class backgrounds who managed to become professors, doctors, lawyers, CEOs, top managers, etc., were getting paid about 16%, 8 to 16% less on average than privileged origin people in those same jobs. And that book got a lot of press, mostly in the UK, but also some here. And I've done a bunch of public talks and working with, with my co-author, Sam Friedman. We've done a bunch of also working with some of the organizations that were profiled anonymously in the book. Some of them have come out about their role in the book. So one of them is Channel 4, which is a UK television production company, and have really worked to make their workplaces more inclusive and equitable for, most of them had programs around race and gender, but they've added programs around class as well. And that's something that has gotten, is still ongoing. So that's sort of piece one. And I was really pleased, when I decided to write a book, when Sam and I decided to write a book, we wanted it to be something that was read outside of the academy. That was really important to both of us. And so I've been really pleased with how that has gone. Probably the second piece is I'm just on Twitter a lot, and I use Twitter both to talk about, issues of class and inequality. My sort of main research interest is really about inequality and political participation, and where our politics come from and how they do and mostly often don't succeed in connecting with regular people. So I use Twitter to talk about that. I also talk about trans issues a fair amount on Twitter. I'm a trans man, and that's really, it's not my scholarship at all, but I guess this is that level 2 that you were talking about. It's important to me to try to both just be available as a role model and to, call out some of the awful stuff that's happening around the country in terms of trans kids and trans adults as well. And then, my current work, I have a book that came out this past summer called Producing Politics, Inside the Exclusive Campaign World Where the Privileged Few Make Politics for All of Us. It's a really long subtitle. And I've also been trying to sort of get that into the public as much as I can. I had an op-ed published in The Hill a little while ago. I've been on a bunch of podcasts, and I just, I've been also talking to some political professionals. Like I interviewed a bunch for the book, but then I've also been talking with people in that world about, again, the ways that it's inaccessible to many people and the ways that some of what is done there is not ideal for democracy. So those are probably the pieces that got me here. I feel a lot less direct policy impact than or practical impact than the other two. But yeah.
So just three slackers, basically. So I guess the premise of this panel is the tension between doing the kind of public-facing scholarship that you're doing or public intellectual work that you're doing, to be more precise, and the demands of a traditional academic career. And I didn't ask you to specify where you were in the tenure process when you were doing all of this, but it all sounds pretty strongly grounded in your academic work. I'm wondering if you could speak to trying to balance the public-facing, the public intellectual work that you mentioned, or any other additional public intellectual work, with a more traditional academic career. Where did it come in with your tenure process, and were the expectations of tenure a challenge as far as being able to do this additional work? So to the degree that you feel, you could expand on that, and we can mix it up. Yeah, Lynnette, go for it. You went second before.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to unpack. So I think it's important to share that I started my career at a small teaching HBCU. So it was very teacher heavy, teacher intensive before I transitioned. So my first two institutions were teaching institutions before I transitioned to Research One. I continued to publish like I was at a Research One to think about mobility. But for me, how I approached this was, the ivory tower was not built for someone who looks like me. This is a very white space, but I didn't want anyone or any institution to take away what I believe at heart, right? And for me, that's the work that means for the community. And I went into the academy like, this is just a job. There's a lot of people who escalate it and think it's more than that. But I'm like, look, I still have my teaching credentials. I can go teach in a high school tomorrow. Right. So for me, I'm like, I'm going to do what I feel is right, and the work that's going to really mean something for the community, versus publishing for publishing's sake and just to get this thing called tenure. So I was very grounded in, this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to do. You either like it or you don't, I don't really care. But funny enough, as I kind of, moved through and made my identity known, all the institutions that I've actually been at have really valued the work that I've done. But again, I think that came from being strong as to who I am. And I say all this to say too, it's also important in leadership positions. So being a chair, I have to write all these promotion packets and tenure packets and stuff, and being able to mentor junior faculty coming up, of being like, it's okay, like, be you, do the work that fulfills you. And so I'll give an example out of junior faculty when I was in an institution out in Chicago. And he does this great, amazing work that's grounded in science education in high schools. And he came to me all panicked, and he's like, I'm going to write this new piece, but I don't know if it's count for tenure because it doesn't have impact. The journal doesn't have impact factor. I'm like, I don't give a beep, right? Right? Your work speaks to teachers, right? Yes. This is a journal that teachers read, right? Yeah. Then you're doing the good work. So I think that for me is what made it so I can kind of move through academia and doing the work that I feel, if that makes sense.
Can I just ask a follow-up, and then we'll come back around? But do you feel that that's your unique experience, that you were valued for this work, or are you feeling that that's shifting more broadly in the academic world where this work is more valued?
I would say it's shifting. So at Rutgers North, we actually have a document for promotion about public scholarship. Yeah. And that this is a way that people can be viewed at, like, what does this mean? What does this look like? We just had a professor in my department, and I had to send out the letters and everything. He just got promoted to full, and all he has is public intellectual work. And he doesn't have much of the traditional academic journals. And so here we are at a research institution, and it's valued, but all the letters that were sent out and came back, they all value the work too. So there's definitely a shift that's happening. I don't know that's because my field of education speaks a little bit more to that. So it'd be interesting to hear, Daniel and Gregory, if that's different for sociology, but I think it's a little bit better of a fit. And I'll say in our field, there's a lot more movement for institutions valuing it.
Great. Thank you so much. Daniel, Gregory, which one of you would like to weigh in next?
I can go, so we just do a completely different order.
We'll see how many different permeations we can get through the next hour.
Yeah. So I just got tenure in March of this year.
Hey,
so
congratulations.
At a certain point that, we can stop congratulating me, but it is still relatively new. And all of so most of what I've done clearly was before I was granted tenure, and, I put in my case about a year ago, a little more than that. I think I've been really lucky in a couple of ways. One is I had a 3-year research focused postdoc in the UK where I could publish a lot and get a lot of stuff in the pipeline. And that meant by the time I was starting my tenure track job at Swarthmore, I had a lot of publications and more on the way from that very nice, pushy 3 years of almost exclusively doing research and writing. And I also had a network of people in the UK to sort of draw on for getting that work out there and so on. I think that was really helpful to me. I think also, Swarthmore is another institution that really values engaged scholarship. It values social justice. It values, you absolutely have to be doing a reasonable amount of research to get tenure, but they also really value sort of all the other pieces of what you might be doing as a scholar. So I wasn't ever between, sort of having the padding of a fair amount of stuff in the pipeline and then knowing sort of Swarthmore's values, I wasn't ever really worried about the sort of, in terms of my career about those issues. I checked with somebody about my last book was with a trade press, not a scholarly press. And I checked, and the response was basically, if it's a good book and it gets out there in the world, then we're happy. It doesn't have to be with a university press. I think for me, the challenge, or just something that I've found that is tricky in terms of balancing, is that it just takes a lot of time to make and build, and like administrative work really, to make and build relationships outside of the academy. And to I actually could tell you because I track my hours, but probably as many hours working on the 800 word op-ed that finally got published as I might spend on a research article. I find that a really difficult style of writing, because I want to explain everything, and you can't explain everything in 800 words. And so I think for me, some of the balance is not so much career concerns as just time. Organizing, like I was talking with political activists in the Rio Grande Valley, and that was however many emails back and forth, and figuring out the transportation, like just all of those sorts of things are time that you can't commit to something else. And that is a balance I'm happy with, but I think it was a little just exactly how much time that takes, especially without, for this book, a co-author who's carrying a lot of it, is really something that is sort of worth considering as you're trying to figure out how public to be and what that looks like.
I would be remiss if I did not point out, this is a plug for our sponsor, that Scholar Strategy Network does really excellent workshops on how to write editorials. Okay, that's the end of that commercial. I'm curious, did you look at the receptivity of the place where you would start your career when you were starting out? I don't know if Swarthmore, I'd have to go back and look and see if Swarthmore was your first place, but like, was that a factor for you, or did you not know that up front and it just sort of lucked out that it was a place that happened to be receptive to that?
I mean, I actually was lucky enough to have more than one choice. I feel like most people don't most of the time. But for me, it really was, that the choice when I had a couple offers was really about where I wanted to live in the world, and Philadelphia beat out London and Maine. And I mean, but I do really appreciate that about Swarthmore. That is one of the things, like, not so much the public face, like, can I be public, but just that it has the values that it has about being part of doing good in the world. That was definitely a plus as well.
Great, thank you. Greg?
Well, let me make 3 or 4 quick points in response to your question. I've always picked topics for my academic work that I thought would be of interest to various people in the public arena. Again, advocacy groups, government agencies. And then when I've done my academic work, I've always tried to spin off public documents from the op-eds, magazine articles. And so I guess one piece of advice I would have for anybody is I think it's dangerous to try to have two tracks, to do your academic work over here and your public work over there. I think that's a way of making sure that both tracks come to a dead end. I think you need to find a way of integrating them. Now, I first got into doing public work actually before I went to graduate school. I was a bartender when I graduated from college. And my first publication was a piece I wrote for the Sunday magazine, the Chicago Sun-Times, about how the bar I worked in kept Black and Latino customers out. And I must admit, I got a kick out of seeing that in print. And when I went to graduate school, being engaged in the public arena was something I was very conscious of. My first job out of graduate school was with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And I always spun off academic journal articles from my work at the commission because I suspected I didn't want to be at the Civil Rights Commission forever. And when Ronald Reagan got elected, everybody who could quit, including me. When I left the commission, though, I'd had a bunch of academic publications. I'd been an ad hoc instructor at 3 different Chicago area universities. So my first full-time academic job, I was actually offered tenure going in. So it's tough for me to say how much this work helped me or hurt me in terms of a career. But I will say in terms of this work, there's a lot of good things going on, like the Scholar Strategy Network and Campus Compact and the Carnegie Classification for public work. There's a lot of good things going on, but I think the real barrier continues to be traditional academic departments and the tenure and promotion process. I've been in a lot of conversations with people who are very progressive in their politics. They march on weekends, and when it comes to evaluating people for tenure, they want to know how many sole-authored articles they've had in the top 4 journals in the field. And I think even deans and administrators are probably more open to the concept of public intellectual work than a lot of our departments are when it comes to this key tenure and promotion process.
Well, on that happy note, what do you think? So we're hearing pretty different experiences, right? Which seems to be to some degree institution specific. So I'm wondering, Greg, if there's particular disciplines that you think are more resistant. How would you explain the discrepancy between what Lynnette's experience was and Daniel's experience was and what you're seeing out there?
Well, I do think some disciplines are more open to this than others. I think that there's urban studies, urban affairs programs, ethnic studies programs that are more open to this kind of work. And even within disciplines, some departments are more open than others. I think sociology is starting to open up a little bit. We do have the community action research grants that we provide that are fairly small, but they help people precisely doing this kind of work. These are grants for people that are working with community organizations on key social problems. And there are some departments in sociology that are building public work into their tenure and promotion guidelines. So I don't want to say too much categorically. I'm guessing political science and economics are probably not as open to this kind of work as sociology, social work, public, like I say, urban studies, public policy programs. But you sort of have, in some respects, you have to pick and choose. If I were advising somebody going to graduate school today who was really interested in doing this kind of work, I would have them look closely at the webpage of the departments they're thinking of applying to, regardless of what discipline they were going into, whether it's history, economics, English, sociology, psychology, or whatever, and look for departments where there appears to be some support for this work. But I think even in the most open departments, in many cases, you're still going to encounter this kind of barrier. So I find myself being schizophrenic when I advise students or new faculty. I emphasize the importance of getting published in traditional academic journals in the field. And I find myself sort of hating the fact that I'm doing that. But if it's somebody who I'd like to see get tenure in my department, I want them to have what I think is the best advice for facilitating success in that process.
Dan, Lynnette, what about you? Have you advised younger scholars in terms of how to, I mean, Lynnette, you mentioned that you basically tell people to just follow their heart, I think, if I caught the essence of that, but do you have other recommendations? And are you hearing from younger scholars? So we just went through a massive hiring process at Blaustein. We hired 8 new tenure track professors, and we're hiring a couple more this year. And I had a number of those that I was interviewing ask me how the school treated public facing scholarship, because I think they saw that I did a lot of that kind of work. And so there just seems to be a lot of interest and energy from younger scholars in that. So I'm just wondering if you're getting a lot of those questions, and what do you say in response? I'm not sure whose turn it is.
So if the question is, am I getting a lot of those questions with junior scholars coming through the ranks? Not particularly. I think because they're being very strategic about where they're applying to. Okay. And, you know, they're seeing a department like ours where there's a number of us that are doing that kind of work. So but I think that's a good sign of change, right? Where they know that there can be choice and selection out there. Even though higher ed jobs can be at a minimum, right? That I am finding that junior faculty who are coming out of, you know, PhD programs are knowing that higher ed also isn't the only place where they can get jobs. Like I just had one of my doctoral students just got a job doing UX researcher work as a qualitative researcher. And I was like, oh, I didn't think about that in terms of technology, right? So they know they have options. So I think they're being very selective in terms of where they are applying. So they know that their work's valued.
Julie, I'd like to respond to that a little bit. I think there are many more students and many more young faculty members who are interested in doing this kind of work. And I think there's going to be pressure on departments and universities to be more accommodating. I'm very optimistic about this. And to some extent for public universities, this may be just their self-interest as they're being cut back by their governors and their boards. This kind of work may be what saves them as people start to realize that this is part of the contribution that universities can make to their communities. Now, having said this, I don't know if this does anybody any good who's coming up for tenure tomorrow or this year. They're not going to benefit from a long-term trend. They're still dealing with the practices that we're seeing today. I mean, I do think it's a little easier today than it was 10 years ago to use this kind of work as part of the tenure profile, but it has to be in addition to the traditional peer-reviewed articles. I think it's going to be very difficult for somebody who only has public work to try to get tenure in most, you know, research colleges and universities.
I want to come back to that. I want to let Daniel speak to the other question about, you know, how to advise younger scholars, but I do want to ask more around, you know, how to push and also how it's being measured. So, oh, Radha's got, okay, Radha, hold that thought. I will, we're going to get to the audience questions in just a few minutes. So Daniel, do you want to speak to kind of the mentoring piece of this?
Yeah, I don't have a ton to say. I mean, I think I agree with what's been said before, both that I also think that, you know, it doesn't make sense to embark on a PhD unless you're doing something you really want to be doing in the first place, because the job market chances for anybody in academia are such that if you're going to be sad you spent time on a PhD, you shouldn't do it. And so that's sort of how I think about it. Like I think we all, I mean, I hear what Lynnette is saying about it's just a job, but it's an amazing job where you get to, you know, if you're lucky, you get to, you know, pursue your intellectual interests and speak publicly about your, you know, what your takeaways from your research are and how you think they ought to shape what people do in the world. And you get to teach students and you get to, you know, you get to do all this stuff. And it's an amazing privilege, I think, to get to be an academic full time. And I'm really lucky that I get to do it. And I think that, you know, I think everybody who who's going into academia or who's sort of trying to figure out their path through academia has to figure out that question of like, how do I want to be in the world as an academic, as a professor, as a scholar, and how can I navigate that the best I can with the, with the constraints that I've got. And I think that, I think Greg is really right that in a lot of places that's going to mean you have to do both, right? You have to really publish in the top journals. Even, I mean, Swarthmore is not a research one, but you really have to do, valid, good academic research in addition to whatever public community stuff you are doing if you want to get tenure. And I think that's, that's how it is a lot of places. So I don't know that I have advice so much. I just have like, the path that I've taken and the approach that I've taken that's worked for me. But I'm also, as a sociologist, really aware that what has worked for me is always some combination of luck and randomness and privilege. And so it may not work for somebody else.
So this is really a question for all three of you, but I think what Greg was saying prompted this, which is, and also what Lynnette said earlier, how do you see this work being measured and evaluated? So we know, Greg, you went down the list of sort of how the traditional approach is, right? How many articles do you have in top journals in your field? What are the evaluation metrics that you think are, or you see being used for public facing scholarship, whether on its own or in combination? As you pointed out, you really can't just do it on its own. And how is this, Lynnette, you mentioned that reviewers are very open to this, or they have been in your experience, right? So how are they evaluating it? What are you seeing from them? So I guess this is to all three of you, whoever wants to. I don't remember whose turn it is at this point.
Well, I'll say the metrics is simple. This is ghettoized as service. And the minute that's done, this work is not going to help you get tenure. I think one of and a lot of the conversations I've been in, the question is, how do we get this kind of work defined as research and evaluated as part of the research part of a tenure file? There's research, teaching, and service. And I'd love to meet the person who got tenured because of their outstanding service work. I don't think that person's been born yet, but so the first step is to try to get this work defined as research. And often when people are doing this kind of work, if they're doing evaluation studies, they do have a document that you can sometimes do have peer reviews of public sociology, and that can help. And again, as I said, that I think that it can't be a matter of running two tracks. I spin off my op-eds from the academic work that I've been doing, so that there's sort of an implicit, I guess, peer review connection when that's the case. But I'd love to hear from Lynnette and Daniel about, the key question is, what are the metrics we can develop, and who are the reviewers that we can develop, who will be able to review and honestly assess and give appropriate credit for this kind of work as research and scholarship, as opposed to just service.
Yeah, so which one of you would like to weigh in? Lynnette, do you want to?
Daniel, can you go? I'm trying to actually pull up our document, our institution's document around this.
Right, so Rutgers has a specific path, which is really nice. And actually, I just went up for full professor on that basis, so I'm very familiar with it. So Daniel, do you want to weigh in on what you've seen as far as,
I can say some words while Lynnette looks for her document. I think, from my, I know I didn't get to see most of my tenure letters because Swarthmore is private and that's how it works. But I know a lot of people said something along the lines of does good research and manages to get it out into the public, or something like that as sort of the evaluation. And Swarthmore, and I think a lot of private places, which are less common, and I think it's really the publics that we need to be thinking about. But Swarthmore has a pretty, there's no metric. There's no, this is the bar, you must be above it. It's just sort of a holistic, you have to be doing well in each of these areas. And if everybody agrees that you are, then you get tenure. So it's not really, it's much less formal. And I think, informal processes both allow for a lot more potential bias and discrimination, and underhanded, nasty things, and they allow for more flexibility and holistic evaluation and really weighing, the public impact or whatever else people are concerned with at the moment. And so I think, for me at Swarthmore, it was the second thing, but I think I don't know that we'd want to go in the direction as a field of higher education of having, less formal rules about what you have to do to get tenure or to get promotion, at least not in the foreseeable future.
This, of course, raises the question of, is this an R1 phenomena? I mean, R1 and elite small liberal arts colleges like Swarthmore. Lynnette, I just changed it so you can share that with everybody if you want to. I apologize that you couldn't previously. We were just trying to keep the questions focused, but.
So what I shared here, I mean, there was probably a 15-person, I think, committee that worked on this for a long time to create it. There's a lot more to this than what I'm sharing, but what you can see are some of the leading questions when considering publicly engaged scholarship. And you can see it's pretty, I think it's a pretty inclusive. But again, I'll say that specifically for my campus, our chancellor is she's awesome.
She is, I agree.
And very, very progressive. And again, that's where I think leadership is important, because she values this work and what it means. And so here you go, that there's now some metrics to help think about it. This document is sent out to reviewers. As a committee, as the case that I was telling you about before, we really thought about, also being strategic about reviewers who understand this work and not just sending it to, Joe Schmo, but really people who kind of understand it. So.
Greg, did you want to weigh in on this at all? Because you were asking about the metrics that are used at schools that are more open to.
Well, I think the issue is coming up with metrics. I see that, like in what Lynnette just gave us, how do you evaluate the impact of,
right. That was my question.
How do you determine rigor? I know one of the challenges I mentioned is coming up with reviewers. A lot of us do work in the public sector or with public audiences, but if we have those folks do evaluations, those are people we know personally, and their letters would be discounted because they're people we know well. One of the things that the ASA has talked about, the American Sociological Association, is can we generate groups of people who have expertise in this area that will be recognized as legitimate reviewers of public sociology that departments could rely on. So I think that challenge is still out there, is finding ways that this can be evaluated. I mean, there are ways of building in peer review. I think, that if work draws on traditional social science methodology, that could be qualitative and quantitative methods of all sorts. If the work is grounded in appropriate literature, academic and otherwise, there are ways, there are things I can think of that would be part of metrics, but I'm not prepared to put out a list of, here's the 5 things you need to do to evaluate whether this work in public sociology warrants tenure or not.
Before we go on, didn't Rada have a question?
She did, and we have actually a couple other questions, and we were just keeping the questions that weren't from the, kind of the pre-questions for the second half of the panel. So we'll switch over to that in a moment.
Gotcha, sorry.
No, I'm not ignoring Rada, and she's one of my colleagues and a beloved one at that, so I wouldn't ignore her anyway. So I'm just curious, actually, Lynnette, I was wondering what kinds of metrics, because I think Greg's getting at where I was going to go with this, which is how, to the degree that you could advise reviewers, and I know it's very limited, or to the degree, not so much advise reviewers, but to the degree that reviewers weighed in on how they thought about impact, is there any guidance that you could share as to what that is?
So that's where it is tricky, right? But I think it's a good thing, because like publicly engaged scholarship can look very different. It can go, look at the 3 of us. We approach it very, very differently, right? So I think that there's a reason why the committee had it opened, and truthfully, I think it worked well for the reviewers, because I can only say so much, but I'm like, here's this document, here are some guidelines as to how the institution's thinking about it. And then for them, they were making sense of what that means from a reviewer standpoint. So I honestly think that that's better, because it would be almost, if you're thinking about evaluation and building a rubric, right? This would be a pretty hard task to do, considering all the different trajectories the work can go. But at least it's giving some breathing room to say that, hey, we do acknowledge this. We do find value. What do you see, reviewers, right?
So I can speak from personal experience that I was encouraged to try to come up with metrics in the statement that went out to reviewers so that they would have some way of evaluating the work that I thought was legitimate, right? That I could document to some degree. I don't know if that's something that you saw in your department as well, or if it's just open-ended.
I didn't. It was open-ended, but okay. That can be another way. Here are the metrics of how I see myself in my work, right?
Mm-hmm. So. And the impact I'm having.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, did you want to add anything to that? No. Okay. And I'm curious, do you see this as an R1 phenomena and elite liberal arts colleges? I mean, do other research universities have less of an emphasis of what Greg is describing? What are the articles in the top journals, or are they equally kind of socialized in that ethos of what is, high quality academics, and it doesn't really matter if they're an R1 or not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure. I think there's probably as much variation within types as between them on so many things, but certainly on this sort of stuff as well. I think there are, I've been giving talks bunches of places, I've talked to lots of people. I think there are, departments in universities that really value public engagement. There are departments, at all kinds of universities that are like, you publish in a journal and that's what counts and nothing else counts. So I don't know that it's a like R1 and elite versus elsewhere thing. There's probably a correlation, but I don't think it's a like one-to-one correspondence.
I mean, my sense is that the less elite schools may be more open to this kind of work. I know, for example, Portland State and the University of North Carolina at Greensboro have developed metrics as part of their tenure and promotion guidelines that incorporate some of these elements that I'm talking about, peer-reviewed, traditional, research methodology. So there's work in this area. But I still, my sense is that the traditional criteria of publication in peer-reviewed journals dominates up and down the prestige scale, at least in sociology.
So we had one question that came in to me, I think, instead of Stephanie, and then Radha had her hand up, and Holila, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that even close to right. What is it?
Kalela.
Oh, okay. I was not even close. So let me share the question, because I don't think Stephanie can see this, from Zhao, which is, can the panelists give an example of one specific public engagement? How did they get it and what did it lead to? I think we started with that. You may not have come in earlier enough, but there's a number of people who joined a little bit later. So maybe one of you could share an example of a specific public intellectual activity and what it led to. When you say what it led to, do you mean in terms of other publicly engaged activities or in terms of academics?
No, just whatever the format is. You did an op-ed, you did a TV appearance or radio or interview, something like that.
Got it. Okay.
What did you get first, and what format did it happen?
Well, I'll give, I guess, one example of a product. I was approached by the National Fair Housing Alliance a few years ago to edit a book on the 50th anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968. So I worked with them. We collaboratively decided who we wanted to write the chapters, and I wrote the proposal, got the contract from the publisher, and reviewed the manuscripts and worked through them until we got a book out. And it got some play. It was given out at 2 events at the new African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. It was distributed throughout fair housing, fair lending advocacy groups. It was reviewed in some journals, but that's one example of something that was a collaborative, I think, piece of public academic work that I also got credit for because it was a peer-reviewed book that was published by a credible publisher. I don't know if that's exactly an example.
Why do you think you got invited to do this?
I didn't hear that.
How did you get invitation? Why do you think you were invited to do this work?
Because I had worked with these folks for 25 or 35 years, and they knew me and I knew them.
I see.
So why don't I turn things over to Stephanie and she can field the rest of the questions. She's got some on chat and some that people have raised their hands. So Stephanie?
All right, so I'll go in order. So I know Radha had raised her hand previously. Radha, did you want to share your question?
Sure. Probably some of what I had in mind was already covered in the discussion since. And I also joined late, so my apologies. So I don't know if this was already discussed. Rutgers, I guess, is arriving somewhat late to the table on this discussion about publicly engaged, community engaged scholarship. And I was invited to serve on a task force that would develop metrics to recognize and reward such scholarships. So I don't know, Julia, do you know that there's something going on like this?
I know that Nancy was part of a workshop, a task force a couple of years ago. This is a new initiative to come up with metrics.
Yeah, so I think Barbara Lee was, she initiated this thing a couple of years ago. But I think now, the thing is being revived to actually develop metrics. So I was just interested to know, I was going to ask the panelists here how their universities dealt with it and how they had developed metrics. So everything that Lynnette put up on this thing was sent to me by the task force also. So this must be a common core of things that's going around. So I do think, I think it's about time that this thing is recognized and rewarded. So I'm glad Rutgers is actually making it a part of. And part of the thing they suggested to the candidate coming up for promotion is to actually get external letters that are from the community organizations that they work with. So, people know what they've been doing. And I don't know if that could be part of the metric, but that's really all I wanted to say. There was no question involved, but I did want to say that Rutgers is acting on some of this research. And I was just curious to see if there are established metrics, because that's our charge in the task force, to develop metrics.
Thanks, Radha. So
meeting in a couple of weeks. So.
I think the reason that Lynnette's looks familiar is it's also Rutgers. But just to clarify, Rutgers has 2 tracks under public facing scholarship. So there's the community engaged research and there's public intellectual. So we've been pushing on the public intellectual side with this panel because we did the community engaged research in the spring, but I think the metrics issue is an issue for both, right? So
yeah, and one of the questions they want us to address is whether the 2 are distinctive.
So here you go. Here's a chance to influence metrics, panelists. If you want to speak directly to a researcher who's going to be very engaged in this discussion. Stephanie, I'm going to turn it back over to you and shut up.
Okay, I'll move over to Jalila. You had your hand up. You're on mute if you're asking. You're still muted. There you go. Can you start over?
Yeah, so I was going to say Greg is going to be familiar with some of the questions or the comments I'm going to make, since he's my colleague and we speak about these things almost on a daily basis. I've been doing this work, public intellectual work, in South Africa for the past 25 years. I was a newspaper columnist for, I don't know, for a decade or like on a weekly basis, but also in the academy. And some of my books, right, published through the peer review process, but some of them not. So here's my question, right? Some of the stuff I wrote either in my newspaper columns or in the non-peer reviewed books have been cited in academic publications a lot. So it would seem to me that academics look at what is being published in op-ed and pieces and in columns, and even in magazines like, magazines that kind of straddle the line between being peer-reviewed and being kind of like for an informed public. I have in mind something like Transition, which is published out of Harvard University. So it seems to me in terms of metrics, it should be easy to measure the impact by just looking at how somebody's work as a public intellectual has been cited in academic journals. That could be one way. But what about books that I wrote deliberately, not as academic books? And I set out to write them to reach a public audience and a large audience. Why can't those books, an example which will be familiar, I suppose, to Americans could be a book like Race Matters by Cornel West. Race Matters is a very kind of like easy reading and not referenced and a popular book, but clearly an informed book, right? Shouldn't there be more consideration to work like that? And I mean, there are many other people, Edward Said, Noam Chomsky, right, who have written books like that. Now, obviously, those people are, of course, right, accomplished academics already, but shouldn't we acknowledge work like that by scholars either in the middle of the game or at the beginning of the game? Thank you.
Could I respond to that in a couple of ways? I mean, in part, Kalela is just a terrible example of somebody to use to see how public scholarship is evaluated, because he has such a strong academic record. Nobody could possibly question him on any traditional grounds. And as he said, he was a newspaper columnist. His public record alone would probably qualify for any kind of promotion. So he's I guess an outstanding example of somebody who has been able to combine both, but not a very good example for somebody who we could use to determine how this work is rewarded. I would say that I think the kinds of books that he's talking about are recognized. I think if you have a book with a traditional press, whether it's a university press or a trade press, my sense is those books are rewarded in the traditional academic process. It's other kinds of public work, testifying before a legislative body or doing evaluation research project for a nonprofit organization. Those are the kinds of things that we find more difficulty in determining how they can be evaluated in the traditional tenure and promotion process.
Thanks, Greg. I hear you.
All right, thanks. I'm going to switch to some of the questions that we received in the chat. One question was, I'm less concerned about the requirements for promotion, but more on the pursuing the impact while avoiding burnout amidst the other demands. Any advice on this aspect of the work?
Well,
I don't know if Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was gonna say, I don't know if I have good advice. I'm at the end of a 10-day trip doing talks and also doing this, and I'm a little exhausted. But I mean, one thing I've sort of come to see and I want to plan for a little bit better, so this is advice to me as well as to other people, is that there's often sort of a cycle, like a book comes out, or for me at least, a piece of research comes out, and then what I ought to ideally do is plan some time where all I'm really doing is probably before and after publication, where I'm really focused on sort of the public impact of that piece of work, rather than also having, a big project going on at the same time, et cetera. So I think I'm starting to get a sense of the sort of life cycle of, I mean, and this is for work that's, that I'm trying to have a public impact, that there's a sort of life cycle of, you have to really spend some time on that aspect of it. And if you are doing that, you're not doing, I mean, especially if you're also teaching and, managing the other aspects of your work, you really can't be moving any other research forward, or at least I haven't figured out how to be doing that. So I think that, and I think that like, it's hard for me to let something else slow down, but it's necessary. And I'm hoping that as I keep doing this, I'll start to be able to anticipate that cycle a little bit better and figure out how to either finish things before I need to start the public part, or put them on, have them be on the back burner during that phase. Because I think that I mean, it's not possible to be, giving a lot of talks or going on a lot of podcasts or doing a lot of media and also teaching and also moving newer research forward, or at least it's not possible for me.
I'd like to answer that two ways. I think it depends on what you want to do. I truly enjoy this kind of work. This is what I think is to me what is most important, and I don't see it so much as a burden. It's not like another university committee I'm asked to serve on, or another search that I'm asked to chair, something like that. I don't see it in the same context. But the fact is, there's only so many hours in a day. And I would say for people who want to do this kind of work, that are concerned about the many demands, I think it's a legitimate choice to say that you're just going to serve on one fewer college committee or one fewer university committee. You're going to take on one fewer, PhD student. You're just going to have to make some choices. And at a minimum, this is at least service, and you can justify this to your university administrators as important community service, that you're not neglecting, the third leg of the promotion thing. You're just choosing different ways to meet your service requirements, while at the same time trying to figure out a way to get this stuff counted as research.
I'm going to be honest, Kelsey. This is something that I constantly have to work and rework for myself. It's a challenge because I do like the work and I'm passionate about it, but there is something as too much of a good thing, right? There is only so much time. You want to do self-care, family, all that other stuff. Before the pandemic, I asked this actually of a scholar in my field who's, I look as a mentor, and he's like, he gets all the asks, and he's like, I have 20 slots, and I'm going to pick and choose for those slots to make sure that it's doing like the biggest impact in terms of community and what that means, which was something that I tried to follow after I had that, but then COVID hit. And it made it way more accessible to do it. So all of a sudden I realized I'm doing, I'm doing 5 radio interviews in one day. Like I can't even go to pee, right? Like it was just becoming too much. And so I think in this new world of Zoom and stuff like that, where people are more accessible, so the asks are a lot more frequent, I think I'm still working on this question myself, so.
Thanks, everyone. And another question is, what resources, whether trainings or mentors, have been most useful to you as you've evolved as a publicly engaged scholar?
I lean hard into mentors. I think it's important because it's to hear other people's perspectives. People do things differently, how they manage things differently. For me, that's been the most important. is mentorship. I have done, like what is the op-ed project, like workshops like that, so on and so forth. But for me, it's mentorship. And then making sure that I do the same for others, right? Lift as we climb.
Yeah, I've looked to mentors. I've looked at people who are doing this kind of work, and I actually asked them, how do they manage their time? Very early on in my career, I took advantage of formal training sessions on how to write op-eds and press releases. When I was at the Civil Rights Commission, this was part of my job to write these kinds of documents, and I was able to get some formal training in this kind of work. And I remember, again, going back to my undergraduate days, there was a guy named Andy Gordon at Northwestern who was appearing in the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times all the time with his maps. And this is before GIS was even a word. And I remember asking him, how did he develop connections with so many different community organizations in Chicago that he was working with? And he said it was simple. He doesn't do anything. He says, if you have something to offer, they will find you. And once Andy got a couple of his maps out with a community organization, lots of others pursued him, and he had plenty of opportunity to do this kind of work. So I've always been a big believer in op-eds, magazine articles, and getting your name out there in public so other people do know what you're doing. And I've rarely written an op-ed where I didn't get a follow-up interview to be on a public affairs radio or TV show, or get a call from a reporter a couple weeks later who was doing a story that wanted some information. That these things kind of build on themselves.
I'll just add, in addition to, asking other people who've done things I want to do, how do they do them? I get a lot from Twitter, both in terms of sort of getting my work out there, but also in terms of finding other people doing similar work, developing networks, talking to people across, both across disciplines and who are not academics at all. I think it's a really, there's as with all things, there are lots of drawbacks, but for me, it's a really great space for sort of being in public and talking across, various kinds of geographic and professional difference. Probably not so much across much class difference, but across geographic and professional differences as well. And that for me is really, fun, and also I think meaningful in terms of both sharing what I've got to say and finding other people.
Plus, in last 5 or maybe even 10 years, organizations like the ASA or the Urban Affairs Association, they have conducted formal training sessions at their conferences on how to write press releases, how to attract public interest in your work, and on various ways of doing this kind of work. So there's more opportunity now to learn how to do this than there was a few years ago.
So we have a couple questions that are related to social media now that we're on the topic. One is that, Twitter is increasingly a way of disseminating this type of information. Do you think that the number of views or engagement could be one of these impact measures that we were discussing previously? And have you seen any other types of measures like that might be used?
Well, there is a measure called the altmetric score, which is an indication of how often an article is cited in a variety of kinds of newspapers and magazines, not just peer-reviewed journals. And I think that's a good way of trying to build this kind of work into traditional promotion and tenure procedures. Our colleagues understand that if your work gets picked up and cited, it's worthwhile, even if it isn't just in peer-reviewed journals that pick up your work and cite it.
And related to that, a couple of questions are asking if you have any advice on how to effectively engage in social media with this work, and how to make that effective and maybe not trivial or like opening yourself up to insults or the world of social media bullies. I
think I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, I think in terms of not opening yourself up to insults, like it's almost impossible. And if you're not someone who, mean, I haven't had a lot of that, but every time I say something about any trans issue, there's a couple people in the replies who want to explain that gender is biological in a fact, and there's nothing anybody could do about it, and trans people are misled, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is exhausting for me. And it sometimes keeps me from even, keeps me from tweeting. So if that's not something you want to deal with, especially if your work deals with anything that has to do with, race, gender, sexuality, any sort of marginalized communities, and if you're part of one of those, then yeah, I just see somebody I see you're saying, Julia, the block feature. Like, there's things you can do, but on a certain level, you are opening yourself up to that, and you have to figure out whether that's something you're up for. And if you aren't, I think that's really legitimate and fine. In terms of like getting stuff out there, I mean, there's sort of basic social media stuff. Like right now, if it has a picture, then it's going to get more views than if it doesn't. And there's, I think really the way, at least for me, for Twitter, it's being on there and, spending, like, that's what I scroll on my phone when I'm waiting in line at the grocery store. And so I just have a sense of how it works and what the norms are. And there's places you can find sort of overviews or guides or introductions or that sort of thing. But a lot of it is just getting a sense of the norms and the practices of that space. And then you'll sort of, I think that for me at least means that I have a not entirely conscious understanding of how to sort of insert myself in ways that make sense. And yeah, and I, when I publish something, I put a thread and I explain I put some of the key images and I explain the key findings, and that's sort of the norm, and people are often really happy to retweet that sort of thing so that it gets out there a little bit. But it's also, I mean, I think the other thing, I'll just say one more thing about social media, is it is a little bit, unless you're like getting all your friends to make sure they retweet your thing or like your post on Facebook to make sure the algorithm really likes it, it's just a bit random what goes beyond your circle and what stays in your circle. It's hard to manipulate or predict. And even if you get your 72 friends to hit the right button, it's still hard to manipulate because they're such big platforms. But as I said, for me, it's really valuable.
Yeah, I'm not on social media much, but if you're doing any of this kind of work, you have to be open and expect to be criticized and ridiculed. I mean, I can't tell you how many ad hominem attacks that I've read in print, in letters to the editor, letters threatening to contact the president of my university to have me fired. Frankly, I kind of enjoy these kinds of things. I find them funny and entertaining because you just can't take them personally. But one form of this kind of public work is to be an expert witness in court cases. And if you've ever done this, and if you've ever been subject to being an expert, when the attorneys for the other side get to question you, you need to understand that their job is to discredit you. In other words, their job is to try to show that you don't use the traditional tools of your discipline, that you're not qualified as whatever you purport to be, that you don't know what you're talking about. If you're troubled by the comments you get back from reviewers of articles you submit to journals, that's nothing compared to the kind of degradation you'll be experienced to when you're serving as an expert witness. And you just have to understand that's their job. It's to discredit you as a professional, and you just move on.
So I wasn't aware. I'm so ignorant about Twitter and social media that I didn't know that there's something called a Twitter block feature. I'm the one who raised the question about, how do you become a public intellectual and protect yourself from, trivialization and insults and degradation and all of that. And I'm heartened by some of the responses, because quite frankly, I've just been afraid of even entering that kind of fray, because at least with letters to the editor, right, in response to an op-ed or a column, right? There's some kind of editorial process that goes, right, that happens there. Nobody's just gonna like write a letter to the editor and start insulting you. I suppose my question is, I mean, the answers I'm getting is that basically it's up to you. Basically, right, it's up to whether you have the thick skin or you don't, right? Basically it's, but I'm not sure if, or let me put it this way, is there any kind of guidance or collective, how do academics, how do public intellectuals engage in social media? Why should it be left to us as individuals? I suppose that's the question I'm asking. Could there be protocols or ways of engaging in that space?
I would guess, most universities have communications offices, that these are people that will help you introduce your work to the public. They'll help you write an op-ed and so forth. My guess, I haven't done this myself, but my guess is they can probably provide guidance on how you should manage or respond or not respond to that kind of input. I mean, ideally, your university will support you and stand behind you in the name of academic freedom. And I think that's usually going to be the case. But it can be helpful to talk to some of the communications folks at your college or university. They may be able to help you manage these kinds of communications.
But outside of that, Greg, I mean, shouldn't there be a scholarly discussion, or are there people who've written about this conundrum?
Yeah, I guess true, and maybe you could write the first article to kick this discussion off. I'm hearing you raising a question that's an important question that we as scholars need to do a better job of addressing, and it's the kind of interaction that can undercut your mental health and your morale. And I think that I'm just suggesting there may be some ways of getting some professional guidance on how to deal with these issues. But I'm not the person to provide it. Like I said, I don't know how many people enjoy being the butt of ad hominem attacks. I may be one of the few, but it could be problematic, and in some cases it can lead to firing. And that's a more serious problem. Yeah. If there's enough pressure that's put on your university to cause some questions about your basic job security.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we'll write that article together.
I want to give everyone a chance to ask their question. Justin, I saw you had your hand up before.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. This conversation has been great so far. So, and it gets me thinking back to the metrics. To me, and I've been thinking about this in my own PhD program. I see like the metrics are largely based on how we define impact in our research, and impact for whom. I think that's a really important question. Like, is it the academy? Is it theory? Is it teaching? Is it the public? It can be all of them, I guess. But to me, and I kind of want to hear your feedback on this in an academic department setting, is like what is it? To me, the question lies in like the value proposition that we want to offer as researchers, right? And that kind of falls into what the department that we are in wants. So, and then this kind of ties into the adjunctification of higher education, which we haven't spoken about yet, which I think can play into this. But like, what do you see the value proposition being for researchers in academia, and even your departments or ones that you know of, when there is kind of, funding being cut, less tenure track opportunities for younger scholars, and then so like what do you see as the value in what we're trying to provide, if it is only for a few academic publications that a handful of people read, or something that'll reach a broader audience through Twitter or whatever. I just kind of, and what are the steps being taken? It sounds like there's new metrics being developed, but as the gatekeepers, what do you do? That's, I guess, kind of a broad question.
I'm hearing a lot of different questions in that question.
Yeah.
So let me start with, I think I want to go back to what Greg said, towards the beginning, which is that the funding is getting cut, but I think those things are creating more pressures for institutions to think differently about the work, to think differently about what are some funding pathways. So there was a lot of questions in there. I still would probably have to process it, but in terms of that, I think with what is happening, those pressures are going to continue to make the institution think a little differently.
Well, you said impact for who or impact for what? I think that normally, how do we do it? We measure the number of times the work has been cited somewhere. That's about as far as we go for impact. And I think that creates the challenge for those of us doing this kind of work. What are some other measures? Again, the altmetric score is one way of measuring impact of this kind of work. I don't want to see us get to the point where, because somebody in our department works with an elected official and they get a piece of legislation passed. I mean, that's great, but I don't want to see others being downgraded because they can't find a piece of legislation they can put their name to. Some of us have been working on poverty for a long time. Should we all be fired because poverty has not been solved yet? I don't want to be measured against that threshold. So, I mean, that's a continuing challenge. I keep coming back to the metric question, and I don't have a good answer.
I mean, I think again, there were lots of questions there, and I think there's sort of an ongoing, at least in sociology, I think in other disciplines as well, there's sort of an ongoing question. I mean, the first ASA I went to was in 2004, and Michael Buravoy was giving a talk about public sociology and how that's something we ought to all be aspiring to, and that was 18 years ago now, right? So it's an ongoing conversation, and I think I also sort of think back to what I said earlier about the issue with metrics. Like, it's very nice when there's clear bars that you have to pass. It gives you a real easy steer about what you need to do, but it also really limits what can be valued and what cannot be valued. And so I don't think there's sort of an easy answer for how do we make sure public engagement is also valued alongside research. And I agree with Gregory. I wouldn't want to see an academy where only what is valued is public impact, right? You can write a really good article and maybe it doesn't get cited a ton of times, but maybe it shifts how some other scholars are thinking about something, and that shifts the work that they do, and that has public impact down the road, or that matters for. So I think that, one of the values of the academy is that we are not constantly trying to, is that we, in an ideal world, we're not only valued by sort of productivity metrics, right? I think more and more we are. But I think that's something to think about as we're asking, how do we make sure public scholarship, public intellectualism, whatever you want to call it, is valued? It probably can't be only metrics, and it probably shouldn't be. But there has to be, and given that everything else is metricified, measured, we do have to think about how to put those together. So that's not me answering a question, that's me sort of posing some more questions. There's a lot of competing forces going on here about, and you mentioned like adjunctification and all of these forces that are really challenging higher education and scholarship, both public and traditional.
Do we have any more chat questions, or?
I think we've covered most of the talk. With the last one is the most challenging part of being a public researcher right now.
This is a challenge that will always be there, just the challenge of not having enough time. I always joke, do you remember there was a show in the 80s called Out of This World, and this girl, Evie, was half alien and she could go like this and just stop time. Kind of wish I just had that power, right? Because there's just not enough time in the day. But I think that's always a scholar's challenge, period. And I think the other challenge is that we are currently in a state where, especially my work's a lot around race, right? And considering post-Trump era, what's happening, just the attacks are a little more, and they're a lot more aggressive, right? There was a time where I used to be like Greg, where I laugh, but when it gets really racialized and threats of rape, I don't really find it funny anymore, and it's just it's constant. So I just the time that we're in has been a big shift, and so for someone with the type of work that I do, it's a little dramatic.
Yes, I think the challenge question, it depends on where you are. There's a big difference between somebody who is an assistant professor trying to get tenure and somebody who has tenure and the freedom that goes with that. It's very different. And now, having said that, one of my concerns is if you spend all your time doing the right things to get tenure and you're successful, then you turn around and the next thing you want to do is become a full professor, and it's the same kind of gamesmanship you have to play, and you can find yourself bordering on retirement before you finally get to the kind of public work that you actually want to do. But I would say, to me, the biggest challenge to this kind of work, I think, continues to be the tenure and promotion process within traditional departments. I think that's changing. I think that will change for what I think is the good in the future, but I think that's a long-term process, and that will only happen if people like the people involved in this discussion continue to not to just do this kind of work, but advocate for this kind of work. So that's something else to add to your workload. Not only are you doing your teaching and research and service, you're doing your public research, but then you're also spending time advocating for people to do this kind of work.
Daniel, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think that, figuring out I think it's mostly been covered, right? The figuring out the balance and how much time you've got and where to prioritize is just really tricky. And I think that's true even if you're not doing public engaged work, but it's probably even more true because there's just different kinds of work that you're doing, right? It's not just that you're, do I do this piece of this research project first or this other thing, but it's also, figuring out how to make the connection with the group that you're trying to connect with, or how to find the people that you want to talk with. And so, yeah, I think that is the biggest challenge. And I agree with Gregory also that the sort of structural challenge about what gets valued for tenure and promotion and what grad schools are. I mean, I think, the other thing we could think about is just I think grad schools, again, at least in sociology, are more and more emphasizing the sort of professionalization, and you need to start publishing as soon as possible. And that contributes to making it difficult for people to think about and do public facing work. So I think those are some of the structural sort of organizational challenges that we have.
I was hoping you'd give us solutions to all of those in the last hour and a half.
Sorry, I was last and I let you down.
No, not at all. No,
what the solutions are.
You guys were terrific. Really fascinating and engaging and very honest, and 3 very different experiences and different perspectives. So that was really terrific. Will you all please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for a job very well done, and yeah, on a very serious note in terms of what Lynnette said too, that is really quite upsetting. I have never experienced anything quite that dramatic. I did have an ethics charge filed against me for my public facing scholarship, but not physical threats. That's just so beyond the pale. Anyway, thank you all. You were fantastic. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Really appreciate the wonderful questions. And thank you, Stephanie, for moderating so well. So we will, if you're not already a member, please consider joining Scholar Strategy Network. It is quite easy to do, and we think it's very worthwhile. So, and you get to hear from wonderful folks like these. So thank you again, and have a good night, everybody.